I'd like to talk about some of our founding documents. So I'd like to talk about the Constitution first. Our students in ninth grade read the entire Constitution. And when they read Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, we have to discuss the 3/5 clause. This clause is often referred to as the 3/5 compromise. Was this clause just a pragmatic compromise? Were there moral principles at stake on both sides? In other words, how do we teach the 3/5 clause?
I think that's a great, important question. And I think it's important when we're teaching the 3/5 clause to teach both the denotation, if you will, the sort of factual part of the 3/5 clause as a compromise and sort of the negotiation that was involved among the participants and the history of that number and that sort of thing. So it's important to discuss the denotation of it, but also the connotation of it and the symbolic meaning of the 3/5 clause. I think it's important to emphasize both, certainly, and not to let the one diminish in any way the other, particularly not to sort of explain away the connotation and the symbolism of the 3/5 clause as simply the result of a compromise and to get lost in the details, so to speak, without emphasizing the important symbolic significance of the number and of the clause. So as a factual matter, it was a compromise between Southern slaveholders who wanted to count their enslaved people as one whole person for the sake of representation, and Northern delegates who wanted to count enslaved people as zero, right? Not at all for the purposes of representation. Because that would, of course, augment the representation of the Southern slaveholders. And so 3/5 is the number between that was used previously under the Articles of Confederation, also to compute in the census how enslaved people would count for purposes of representation. It wasn't a number that was invented at the Constitutional Convention, but it was sort of carried forward from that previous compromise. But the connotation, I think, of it in many ways has been more important and is more important to focus on as stating that, reflecting the fact that these people believed African Americans who were enslaved at the time to be 3/5 of a human being, or equal in value to 3/5 of a human being. So I think that's not in any way, some might say, that's not in any way a misrepresentation of the clause. I think it's an important meaning of the clause. And James Madison wrestles with this in really painful, interesting and painful ways in Federalist Number 54, which is very difficult to interpret. I think he's actually subtly undermining the thinking behind the 3/5 clause, that it really is a problematic contradiction to have that in the Constitution. In my interpretation, that's what he's doing there. But yeah, I think it's important to keep both of those in mind, the factual element as a compromise, and then the connotation and the symbolism as well.
So the two sides, yes, for sure. We with careful and a more in-depth reading of that part of the Constitution, you understand that these are numbers that they're playing with to gain more ground and power and so on. But when you're Black, if you're a Black student in a classroom and you're told first that this is actually what they were doing, and it wasn't really saying that you were less than, it's hard to get beyond that. It's hard to consider or to be magnanimous enough to say, okay, well, it wasn't actually, saying that I was less than, because the fact is that you were still negotiating my humanity, right? You were still playing with numbers on my full human status, right? So what Adam is saying, I totally agree with, and I know him well enough to know that when he says that the focus really should lean towards talking about that connotation, that he means that, right? That we should remind ourselves of how ridiculous that would feel like to people of color, to Black people, to even have that in the Constitution, even though a wider look at it is, it is really about the South wanting more representation, the North trying to skew that, so that in the end, we do have some equality or some gaining of ground in terms of getting rid of slavery. But it's still very hard to hear for a student. I know we teach this part of the Constitution in Race and the American Story, and we've taught it many times, and our African American students, they pause on that one. That's one that we spend a lot of time on, because it's very difficult for them to hear that the founding fathers, or a group of white men, got together and put this phrase in the Constitution, and that had an impact on the personhood of their ancestors. It's difficult.
Just to add to that, I think that's what you said made me think too. Just the mere fact of putting a number, quantitative value on a human being is in itself problematic, very problematic. And the idea that the worth or value of a human being could be measured in that way, or measured against other humans, 3/5 versus 1, that in itself, that exercise is a dehumanizing exercise for anyone to have participated in. And so I think it's important to also reflect on that process, I think, itself, as important for students to reflect on and learn about and understand that in itself was problematic, regardless of the numbers. Just the quantitative measurement of human value is wrong.